Good afternoon, everybody. This first, the ones that are here, who has actually been exposed to NEPA, and has anybody been exposed to Gulf One? Anyway, well, what we're going to talk about, this is an overview of NEPA and what the NEPA process is, and it's for transportation projects in the state of Florida. And we're also going to talk about the state transportation, environmental process, which is a little bit different from NEPA when a federal action is not required. To start off, let's talk about first a transportation project. A transportation project typically has 5 segments to it. The first segment is a planning segment where an issue is identified. From there, it then goes to what's called the PD&E, which is what we're going to talk about now, which is the project development and environment section of the project. And at this point, it's governed by both NEPA and or state environmental processes regulations. Once the PD&E is completed and what's called a preferred alternative is selected, we then go to the design phase of a project where that alternative is designed and environmental permits are acquired. From there, the DOT will then buy right-of-way to construct the project, and then construction will start. As you can see on this slide, the process itself typically takes about 10 years. To be honest, 10 years is very fast. Many of the ones I worked on have been 15 years or more. So you've got to keep that in mind when you're looking at this thing. The National Environmental Policy Act is the act that governs NEPA, or governs the PD&E process. It's an act that was passed in late 1969. It was signed into law by Richard Nixon on January 1st, 1970. Very interestingly, this was a very bipartisan act. It was approved by both the Republicans and Democrats, which, looking at today's, government, it's somewhat surprising. The act itself, the purpose of the act is found in Section 2 of the act, and it's written right here. And as you can see, it's basically trying to find a balance between what we need as humans and the environment being protected and not destroyed. The interesting thing about this statement, it always kind of stuck with me, was the very last thing. It states about natural resources and the environment and ecology. And then at the very end it says, and to establish a council on environmental quality. It just seems kind of out of place with the statement, but that part of this statement is one of the most important parts of NEPA. All right, why was NEPA brought into existence? Well, prior to the 1970s, pollution in the United States was unbelievable, really. I've got a couple of examples here. Cuyahoga River in Ohio, it literally caught on fire and they couldn't put the river out. It burned multiple ships in the river. It literally, think about that for a second, a river on fire and you couldn't put the fire out. Another thing these are actually probably the 2 acts that really caused Congress to come together. The Santa Barbara oil spill, 100,000 barrels of crude oil were dumped on the beaches of California in about 10 days. These actions were not illegal. There were no law that prevented them from occurring. So as such, Congress sat down and said, we need to do something. And it started with NEPA. It went on, the Environmental Protection Agency was formed in 1970. The Clean Water Act was implemented in 72. But they had actually started working on some of this stuff earlier on. If you look, the Clean Air Act in 1963 was a result of a lot of the industrial activities in the Northeast and North Central states. The act itself has 2 parts. The first part is the National Environmental Policy, which is, this is what the intent of this act is. This is why we're doing this act. The second part were provisions to ensure agency implementation. And this is where I said the Council on Environmental Quality is extremely important. CEQ develops the procedures and the guidelines that each federal agency must use to implement NEPA. And the application of NEPA, first it applies to all federal agencies. It's required whenever a federal agency undertakes an action, provides funding for a project, which is like federal highways giving the state DOTs money to build a road, permitting, such as the Army Corps of Engineers doing a wetlands permit, and approval, such as the approval of a pipeline or something of that type. Each of these actions require a NEPA document by that federal agency. And it requires that agency to consider environmental impacts of the proposed action and to look at reasonable alternative actions that can be used to minimize or avoid those impacts. When it first started, NEPA was for major projects. Now NEPA is done for pretty much all projects. It's just the degree of NEPA that changed. The Act also requires a systematic interdisciplinary approach, and you're going to find out how interdisciplinary it is as we keep talking. It requires the development of specific methods and procedures such as noise modeling, air quality modeling, traffic modeling, things of this type. And for all major actions, it requires the development of a detailed environmental document statement. This is typically referred to as part of the EIS process. However, it has progressed into other types of documents done for NEPA. I wanted to kind of give you an idea of the type of things that you have to look at when you do a NEPA study. These are federal acts, executive orders, DOT orders, CEQ orders. And this is by no means all-inclusive. This is just a list of certain acts that you have to look at and address as part of the NEPA study. In terms of a NEPA study, you typically have and a federal agency can fall into one of three categories. It can be the lead federal agency. For a Department of Transportation project, that's typically the Federal Highway Administration. However, it can also be the U.S. Coast Guard, depending on the Coast Guard regulates bridge structures over navigable waterways. You have what's called a cooperating agency that has a specific interest in that project. And a cooperating agency is an agency who's also working with the lead agency, and that document will be their document as well. They will sign that document for approval. And I've shown the two agencies that I deal with most, being a lead and a cooperating agency. Coast Guard and Federal Highways, Department of Transportation typically work hand in hand on a lot of projects because you'll have a roadway and a bridge project together. One will take the lead as the lead agency. The other one will be a cooperating agency and have their signature on the document as well. Then you have coordinating agencies. These are agencies that the lead agency talks with and asks for concurrence on certain determinations. Protected species. The lead agency makes a determination of effect on protected species. They will either ask the National Marine Fisheries or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for concurrence with that determination. And then that goes into the public record in the document. This is a general step down of the process used to do a PD&E study. The first thing you do is determine a purpose and need for the project. That starts in planning with the problem. And then as part of the PD&E document, the NEPA study, you will develop a purpose and need. Why are we doing it? What's the purpose of the project? This determination of class of action is something I'll talk a little bit more later, but a class of action is the level of NEPA assessment required for a particular project. Then develop and evaluate alternatives. All right, I have a problem. I need to get from here to here. How do I do it? I'll develop a series of alternatives to look at, and I will analyze those alternatives and look at them relative to environmental effects. And then I will send that out to the public. Let the public make comments on it. Public comment is a very critical part of NEPA. I've actually seen projects stopped because of public input. And then you finalize the environmental review and develop your document. And then what we call the approval of the final document and location design. We call it LDCA, Location and Design Concept Acceptance. which is the end of the project. The documents are signed and you're approved to move to the next phase of the project. All right, I had mentioned, I was mentioning that a NEPA document is dependent on the level of detail required. For a federal NEPA, there's three categories. What's called a categorical exclusion, which singularly or cumulatively does not result in significant environmental impacts. There's certain types of projects that do that. An environmental assessment, which is kind of middle of the road, and an environmental impact statement, which is a project we know has major environmental impacts or significant environmental impacts. And I'll mention later on the term significance being eliminated. And it's been changed to substantial because of the statistical reference to significant. So the state, if there's no federal funding involved and the state does it with state funds or local funds, you have two types of actions. A non-major state action, which is a minor action, and a state environmental impact report or a SEER document, which is a more major state action. And one thing I'd like to point out, in 2016, FDOT assumed Federal Highway's role in doing NEPA. It's called NEPA assumption. There's about 8 states in the U.S. that do this. And they basically review the documents done at a local level. They review it at a place called OEM, Office of Environmental Management in Tallahassee, and they approve the document. And with Federal Highway is an overview agency who inspects certain documents. And if you're really interested in NEPA, this is probably the best document in the country to review. I'm biased because I helped write some of it, but anyway, it's the FDOT PD&E manual. If you go to just a search browser and go FDOT space PD&E manual, it'll pop up. It's about 45 chapters, and it walks you through everything NEPA. And this is the document that governs how DOT and the state of Florida does NEPA. All right, I mentioned the 3 classes, and I'll kind of give you a little bit of a walkthrough of each of those. The categorical exclusion. As I made a statement, it's actions that by themselves or cumulatively do not result in significant environmental impacts. Each individual federal agency develops a list of what they consider categorical exclusions. And the Federal Highway actually has 2 types. They have type 1s that do not require administrative approval, and type 2s that do require administrative approval. The type 1s are things such as providing funding to buy pickup trucks, buying equipment for an office or something like that. It's expenditure of federal funds, but from an environmental standpoint, it doesn't really result in any environmental impacts, and it doesn't require an administrative approval. Type 2s are a little bit more involved. Certain instances, adding a travel lane to a roadway within existing maintained right-of-way. Things of this type, you look at it and you go, all right, that's not a major environmental effect. It's not a significant impact, so it can be done as a categorical exclusion. It requires less environmental detail in the analysis. And one important thing, it only requires that you carry forward your action and a no-build action. So you can make a determination, we're going to do the project or not do the project. The environmental assessment is not an action document. It's called a decision document. It's kind of, when I mentioned it's kind of in between the two. What happens is you have projects, okay, I know are not significant impacts. I have projects I know are significant impacts. Well, what about those gray areas where we don't know? Well, in those areas, you do an environmental assessment. And that environmental assessment is, all right, we're going to develop alternatives. We're going to look at those alternatives. Then we're going to assess them to see if there is a significant environmental impact. If there is no significant environmental impact, then it goes to what we call the findings of no significant impact, what we call the EA FONSI. That's a document that can be signed and the project's completed. If it's determined that there are significant impacts, the project then carries forward into an environmental impact statement. And this particular type of document requires not only the assessment of your preferred alternative, but assessment of alternatives to your project that can minimize or avoid impacts. and you always carry the no-build process through. There's always the option of not doing anything. Environmental impact statement. This is a document that's the most advanced of all of them, and there's very specific criteria to do an environmental impact statement. Just to let you know, though, in the state of Florida, I'm not aware of one being done in probably 15 to 20 years. I'm working on a project that initially started as an EIS and has now been downgraded to an EA. We're in our 16th year of the PD&E study. I mean, it's been a while, okay? Again, you don't necessarily have to do an EA to get to an EIS. Like I said, there's certain projects that are just very obvious, significant environmental impacts, move to an EIS. This is also very important. When I get to public involvement, I'll explain some things that you have to do that's only required for an EIS. All right, for, again, non-federally funded actions, I made, again, I put it in red because it's use of only state or local funds. There's no interstate involvement. If you have a project that ties to a federal interstate, then it's going to be a federal document. Again, there's two types. Non-major state action, which is pretty much equivalent to the federal highway type 1 categorical exclusion. They're very minor actions. The state environmental impact report, however, anything else, a type 2 categorical exclusion, an EA, and an environmental impact statement, it's equivalent to those. You do an assessment. One thing I should point out too, I mentioned that this state has not done an EIS in probably 15 to 20 years. The type 2 categorical exclusions done by the DOT in the state of Florida are probably at the same level of detail as an EIS in any other state in the union. I mean, so they take NEPA seriously in this state. Again, these actions do not require any federal approval, and they're typically done by the DOT district secretary. DOT has 7 districts, each has a secretary. They have an 8th district, which is Florida's Turnpike Enterprise, which runs all the toll roads, and the secretary of those districts sign that document at the local level. The major components of a NEPA document, a description of the proposed action, what are you doing? The purpose and need for the action, why are we doing it? Why is it needed? The alternatives considered, including the no-build alternative, and then we do an environmental analysis. You look at what is the environment that's being affected, and then what's the environmental consequences of my alternatives? What are we affecting? How are we affecting? Then the last part is the public involvement, where we present information and receive comments. All right, the analysis, again, the affected environment and environmental consequences. These sections are broken into 4 separate pieces. Sociocultural, the human environment, cultural resources, historic, archaeological, parklands, conservation lands, those type of areas, natural environment, wetlands, protected species, water quality. Physical environment includes air, noise, contamination, things of that type. You have to look at each of these parameters as part of a NEPA study. Sociocultural effects, as I had mentioned, if you look up here, everything from economics, community cohesion. Community cohesion is where, if I sit and put a 4-lane roadway through the middle of a community, it tends to tear the community apart. Demographics is something. Environmental justice has only come into play probably in the last 15 to 20 years. It deals with, if you look at old NEPA studies, one of the variables that all the agencies looked at was cost. It's always cheaper to put a project through a low-income, depressed neighborhood than it is to a rich-income, non-depressed neighborhood. So they brought about environmental justice so that you could balance and look at these communities in a special way. Additional things you look at, land use changes, mobility, aesthetics, and relocation potential. How many houses, how many businesses am I relocating? And farmlands, I never quite understood why they put farmlands under sociocultural, but they did. And the FPPA is the Farmlands Protection Policy Act of 1981. There's certain farmlands that you have to try and protect. From cultural resources, as I've mentioned, archaeological and historical resources, there's two primary laws that you have to meet for this. One is Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which is implemented by the State Historic Preservation Officer, and it deals with impacts to all historic and archaeological resources. When I say historic, it's historic resources that are eligible or are listed by the SHPO. There's a lot of historic resources, a lot of bridges that are over 50 years old, but they're a common bridge. They're not significant, so the impacts to those structures are not considered really significant. The other action is Section 4F of the FDOT, or the U.S.C. Act of 1966. 4F is you do the 106 as part of SHPO, you do the 4F as part of the federal highways approval. And you have to justify the impact at a much higher level than even for the SHPO. Recreational resources, you have parks and recreational lands. Again, Section 4F, you have to justify those impacts. And there's an act that comes up every now and then, it's called 6F, the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act, which is implemented by the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or Soil Conservation, which used to be the old name. And there's certain funds that were used to acquire properties for preservation. And if you hit those, you have to coordinate with that agency as well. Natural resources, wildlife and habitat, protected species, essential wetland impacts, essential fish habitat. Essential fish habitat are regulated species that are regulated by the National Marine Fisheries Service as either commercially important or ecologically important. Water quality and quantity, special designations, coastal barrier resources are lands along the coastline that are regulated by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, coastal zone consistency, aquatic preserves, wild and scenic rivers. In the state of Florida, we only have two. And somehow or other, I've managed to hit both of them at one time or another. But that's another act, and that's actually implemented by the Federal Park Service. And then, of course, another area we have to look at what permits and approvals are required for the project. The physical environment, highway traffic noise, how does that affect local residents adjacent to the project? Air quality, contamination, you can look down the list. Again, bicycles and pedestrians, I never quite understood why they put under physical instead of sociocultural, but they did. And navigation, which is bridges and navigable waterways. Now, from a public involvement standpoint, I made a comment about EISs, and there's a significant difference between EISs and other NEPA documents. With an EIS, you have to do what's called a Notice of Proposed Agency Action. It's a written notice that's provided to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency that is put in the Federal Register to notify everybody that a specific agency is doing an environmental impact statement on this project. You then have to do what's called an advance notification to the state clearinghouse. This notification, that is with all NEPA documents, and it looks at various things like I've mentioned, coastal zone management, coastal zone consistencies, all of these things. The clearinghouse sends it out to all the agencies, who comes back and provides information. Yes, it meets our standards. No, it doesn't. They have to do this, that kind of stuff. As part of an EIS, you also have to do what's called an agency scoping meeting, which is at the very beginning of the project. You get all of the agencies together, show them an idea of what the project is generally, where the project is, and ask, what are your concerns? And that information is used initially to help with development of alternatives. DOT has another process they use, which is called ETDM, Efficient Transportation Decision Making, which is a much more complex process, and it helps a lot in terms of planning for these studies. You then have a public information meeting to show the public the various alternatives and get feedback. Then you have a public hearing after you've decided on a preferred alternative to get feedback from the public on that preferred alternative. So public involvement is very, very extensive when it comes to a NEPA document. In fact, if you look at the cost of a NEPA document, it probably entails about 25% of the cost to do a study. Certain things you use, other meetings you have, and other things you use for public involvement. Local meetings, you have what's called I'm assuming everybody's planner, so it's MPO, TPOs, tax, CACs, local government agencies, regulatory resource agencies. You'll have a whole suite of these meetings while you're doing the study. You also have small group meetings with residential areas, stakeholder forums, different materials you would use include everything from websites to newsletters. And what you see here is a typical newsletter. It's explaining this is what's there, this is what we're doing, come to the meeting, that kind of stuff. Handouts at meetings, presentation boards, formal presentations both in person and online. In fact, next Thursday, we're doing one for a segment of State Road 70 in Highlands County. If you go onto the website, it's State Road 70 from County Road 29 to Lonesome Island Road. If you'd like to see what one looks like, you could go on and just log in because it's going to be both virtual and in person. And right now, DOT is doing all of their workshops and hearings virtually and in person. Timelines. In 2017, there was a new executive order issued that tried to limit the timeline for doing NEPA studies. Initially, prior to that executive order, the timeline rule of thumb was a categorical exclusion anywhere from 12 to 24 months. Environmental assessments, 2 to 3 years. EIS is greater than 3 years. That particular executive order and the rules were revised by CEQ in 2020, required categorical exclusions. They didn't put a timeline on them. They assumed they would be a handful of months. Environmental assessments could be no longer than 12 months in time length and no more than 75 pages, excluding appendices. Trust us, we developed a lot of appendices after that. Environmental impact statements, 24 months and 150 pages. They did give an allowance for complex projects of 300 pages. And as what I put here is actually a PD&E schedule. I developed this particular schedule. They typically have anywhere from 250 to 300 lines of actions associated with them, and they're all interlinked and interrelated. And it's something that you'll learn you have to do to keep track of these projects. Just a quick, they said that we're going to put this up, so I threw this in here. This is a process, like we've mentioned, the 3 types of projects. Determination, if it's a significant, no significant impact, categorical exclusion. If it is significant, EIS. If you're not sure, you do an EA. Then you make a determination of significance or not significant. So the process itself, the direction is basically 3-legged. Now, with all that said, right now CEQ is revising the guidelines as we speak. I've actually reviewed and made comments on them. These are a few of the things. There's a lot of subtleties that they're changing. But like I said, they're removing the word significant impact and using the term substantial because, again, significance implies statistical analysis, and a degree of assurance. But it's now normally what you would do in a NEPA document. You would have, all right, here's a description of the areas, the environment that's being affected. Then you would have a separate section on these are the impacts associated with that environment. They allowed you to combine those 2 sections now, which actually makes it a little bit clearer to read, because what you find yourself doing is having to go back and forth between the 2. There used to be a terminology of extraordinary circumstances. It precluded you from using a categorical exclusion. They've changed that language to where it does not any longer, make it a categorical exclusion unusable. Something that I found personally very, very critical is they use the term mitigated fonzie. Like I said, you get to an environmental assessment, you're not sure of an impact. What a mitigated fonzie allows you to do is I identify an impact. To offset that impact, I'm going to mitigate it, either through the If it's a wetland impact, I mitigate it through acquisition of wetland credits or building a new wetland. And things like this, you can actually take an EA and make it the findings of no significant impact through the use of mitigative actions, which is something that speeds up the overall process itself. You know? And something I also found is, and it said, you can conduct public hearings and public meetings by means of electronic communications, which it literally, the way I read it and I asked a question about it, it literally stated that you can do your public hearings now fully electronic and no in person. And I found that very interesting because there's a certain group of people, I mean, old people like me. I mean, there's a lot of people who don't have computers, who aren't computer savvy, and so they can't, you know, they need to see something. And I'm really curious how this ends up coming out in the final act, final revisions to the act. And the one thing I skipped over, which is one of the most important things, in 2017, cumulative effects was they were eliminated from assessment as part of NEPA. They are now put back in. And cumulative effects are past, present, and reasonably foreseeable actions, which means not only do you have to take a look at what you're doing, but look at what's happened in the past, what's happening now, and when they say reasonable foreseeable future actions, that's the tricky part. How do you determine that? Well, we've done cumulative effect studies, and the University of Florida produced a model called the Lucius model, Land Use Conflicts Identification Strategy, which we use, and it does an assessment of projected development based on existing proposed parameters and anticipated parameters. And it looks at how the environment will look, say, in 2045, something like that. And you can use a lot of that information to develop your cumulative effects analysis. Well, with that, if I haven't totally confused you, anybody have questions?
Yeah, where does the PD&E study and the SCIS come in?
In the S and what?
And the whole NEPA process.
PD&E is a blanket statement used to cover NEPA and state actions. The PD&E process is project development and environment studies, and it's how DOT implements NEPA and how they implement the state process. And it comes directly from a lot of those acts I showed you, and including state legislature and state laws too. Just to let you know too, the state process is really very few differences between the state process and the federal process, other than 4F is one that the state doesn't do. Farmlands, the state doesn't do because those are required for state funding, and the state doesn't do them.
Yeah, I have a question. And, I think in the January, I visited a newly built community, and that was very close to I-75. I feel the noise from the I-25 and very loud and uncomfortable. And in this situation, did the community construction project require an environment assessment? And also in the future, and does the FDOT have a responsible for to do some kind of change to reduce the noise?
Yeah, all right. Yeah, noise on a lot of projects is very big. I finished a PD&E study that's 36 miles long. We have noise barrier walls on probably 55 or 60% of it. And the way that's done, you have what's called a noise study. And the noise study looks at it is directly related to traffic, offset distance, and then they look at what's called a noise barrier. They say different methodologies. The reality is a noise barrier wall, okay? We'll put a wall up. And you look at different heights of the wall, and you look at offset distance, and you have what's called impacted receptors, which are impacted by a noise level at a specific amount, and you have benefited receptors, which are, if I put a noise wall up, they benefit by a reduction in noise of a certain amount. Interestingly enough, and it's really hard to understand for me anyway, with noise is, I don't have to be an impacted receptor to be a benefited receptor. And then what they'll look at is, all right, I have a wall at a certain height, and I have X number of benefited receptors. If I multiply the number of benefited receptors by a given per receptor cost, and it varies through the years, I think right now it's like $42,000 per receptor, do I fall under that amount based on this? And if the wall costs more than that amount, no wall.
Okay.
Well, I can't say that. I take that back. Theoretically, no wall. Yell loud enough, you'll get a wall. I mean, DOT, it's not just DOT, it's a lot of agencies, they will put in walls because, it's just kind of the right thing to do.
Yeah, however, highways are supposed to have a scenic aspect to it, and the sound barrier walls on the interstates block the scenery. Yeah.
Well, the scenery in those particular areas are houses. Because you're not going to have scenery in an area where you have a noise barrier wall, because you have to have a certain density of homes to even generate enough cost to build a wall. And so the densities of houses in those areas are typically pretty high. It'll be a residential community adjacent. And other factors
why they
that
weren't around in the 90s where I grew up.
What?
I just wonder why they weren't around in the 90s when I grew up.
What, noise walls?
Yeah.
Well, NEPA is constantly evolving. Like I said, environmental justice when I started, there was no such thing as environmental justice. Environmental justice came around in about I want to say between 15 and 20 years ago. It started in NEPA. And again, it was one of those things that again needed to be assessed and needed to be added.
Mark, thank you for the talk on the generally talking about NEPA and the environmental process in Florida. I'm kind of curious about you mentioned that the FDOT has not been doing EIS for over 15 years.
Yeah, again, the EIS is a very specific process. It's interesting getting one through. I think the last one that was done in the Jacksonville Loop, the road around Jacksonville. I was one of the reviewers for Central Office of DOT for that study, and that was probably the last one I can remember ever being done. That's been 15, 20 years ago. But the type of document you do is not nearly as important as the level of detail in which you do your study. DOT down here, I mean, I've done work all over the country, and like an EIS in North Carolina, the level of detail of a type 2 categorical exclusion in Florida is probably higher. I mean, and so that's probably why, and that's probably why they get away with it. I mean, so. It's more of a procedural process.
What kind of project? I'm kind of interested in knowing what kind of projects like Florida have been doing for the category.
Category exclusion?
Yeah.
About roadway widenings, roadway extensions, a lot of things like that. The EA I'm mentioning is they're doing a bypass around this town of Immokalee along State Road 29. That's elevated to from a type 2 to an EA. In reality, it probably shouldn't be, but because it started as an EIS, they're not going to go from an EIS to a categorical exclusion. So they kind of agreed in the middle somewhere to say, we'll do it as an EA. To give you an idea of the bigger EISs I've worked on, I did a project for the South Carolina State Ports Authority, which was a new container terminal for container ships, the ships with the boxes on them, in the port of Charleston. That had 11 what we call post-Panamax berths. Post-Panamax ship is about 1,100 feet long by 150 feet wide, and it drafts 43 feet underwater. They call them post-Panamax because it won't fit through the Panama Canal. And this had 11 berths for those ships. And we also had 11 miles of heavy rail and 7 miles of road with a major interchange to an interstate. That was an EIS. And the cost to construct that was about $5 billion. There was no way around that one.
We have about like 15 persons attending the seminar online, and I don't know if they can hear me, but if they have any comments or questions, you can like just mute yourself and raise the question. I mean, one question about like I think Lisa was asking whether or not the slides can be available online.
Yeah.
Asking about whether or not these slides are.
Yeah, I mean, you can have whatever I've got.
Maybe later we can keep a copy of the slides. Well, I don't see any other inputs from people. Any comments, questions here? I mean, any type of questions. So you mentioned like generally, how about the top? I mean, how long it takes for the GIS?
Yeah.
Big picture.
All right, yeah, like I said, the executive order resulted in CEQ saying 24 months. The problem you have is, and this is where public involvement, the thing I didn't mention about that executive order is it eliminated about 75% of public involvement.
Okay.
You know, it basically tried to streamline it by saying, we're going to do it, trust us, don't worry about it. And that didn't fly very well. And like they said, 12 months for a type 2 categorical exclusion. Well, the type 2 categorical exclusions does not require a public workshop, but it does require a public hearing. Now, what we're doing, what I mentioned next Thursday, is a public hearing. I've been working 2.5 months getting ready for the public hearing. So, all right, so if I eliminate 2.5 months here, I've got to have everything done there, and as you go. Because the reason I say 2.5 months, because if you do a public hearing, documents have to be available for review by the public no less than 21 days before the hearing. You have to notify the public 14 days before the hearing, then no sooner than 7 days before the hearing. You have certain requirements that you have to provide to the public for the hearing. So by the time I do that, I'm backed out 2 months. So if I'm trying to do an environmental type 2 categorical exclusion in 12 months, that gives me 10 months from the time we start to develop the purpose and need, review the natural environment, develop alternatives, assess the alternatives, determine what a preferred alternative would be, write the documents, and get them in the library. It doesn't work. So generally they left it open to the head of the various agencies to extend that time with a reason why they extended it. I don't know of any type 2 that's really been done in 12 months. I don't know that you can do it correctly in 12 months.
And you mentioned that like one project was basically terminated by the public in your presentation.
Which one was what?
I mean, I think you mentioned there's one project that was terminated due to the public impact.
Actually, the Florida Department of Transportation District 1, there was a bridge called the Fort Hamer Bridge. It was later built with private monies from private developers, but it went across the Manatee River upstream of I-75, It started off as a DOT project, and there was so much outcry over it that that project was killed. You know, and so the public involvement was such that it ended that project.
There's no other alternatives, I mean, just like.
Well, no, I mean, the problem is, you know, like when you have a purpose and need, and by the way, purpose and need can be a living document. It can morph as you move through the process. When you come up with something, well, this isn't quite everything, but it's most of all we want, that kind of stuff. You can alter the purpose and need statement as you move through a project. You just have to be very careful and justify it. But no, that project really, you were either going to put a bridge over the river or you weren't going to put a bridge over the river. I mean, it's like,
No other way on.
yeah, it's like, so.
All right, I think, let me see, what I mean. Oh. Okay, so we don't have any question on that. Any other comments on the follow-up questions here in the room? Okay. Okay. No, then probably we can end. We're gonna end this seminar a little bit earlier ahead of schedule. But Mark, I think we have Mark's contact information. Okay. And maybe you're gonna keep a copy of the slides, and for anyone who are interested in follow up with this, and you can get a copy. And eventually, all these the recorded seminar will be available online. All right. And with that, thank you all for coming to this Friday seminar, and thank you all for the online who are also in attending the seminar. And also, please join me in thanking Mark for his time and his great presentation on this environmental process and the NEPA.